Make a video in a way I've never made one before. I'm going to talk about somebody else's comments on YouTube. I'm trying to avoid doing too much of this because I think this can get into a YouTube kind of dialogue, which is very helpful sometimes. But I do think engaging this particular individual's comments is helpful to think about training and to think about if you're into Olympic style weightlifting. Or just sports in general, what is the right approach? And so I'm going to talk about what a famous strength coach, I'm sure many of you heard of him, from Starting Strength. He came up with the brand, and that would be Mark Rippetoe. I've actually dialogued with Mark Rippetoe briefly. He would never know who I am, and nor should he. He had made some comments about academia years ago and how academic programs are basically garbage in exercise science. And as a professor, I agree with him 100%. We've actually, when I took over the program at currently, it was in disarray. It was just a waste of time. It was a babysitting service for athletes, to be honest with you. And I feel good about what the program has become. However, I would love to see the program become even more rigorous, and that's on me to continue to extend that. That's a sidebar. I'm saying, I just want to set that up to say, I know Mark Rippetoe's comments can be a little bit abrasive, but at the end of the day, and I like abrasive, I'm from the strength conditioning world. If you've ever been in a weight room, right, a strength conditioning weight room, back in the day especially, it's a little bit softer now, but those were really abrasive places that you just learn to deal with things as you should. You suck it up, buttercup, as we say. But I like a lot of what he has to say. And so in this particular podcast, he talked about Lasha, the famous super heavyweight weightlifter. If you're not familiar with him, look up his videos. He's 6'8", 370, snatched 223 in the Olympic Games, went 6 for 6, gold medals across the board, whooped everybody by like a long shot, world records across the board. Man is strong. There's no doubt about it. Rippetoe's contention was, though, that the world record in the clean and jerk is 266, and that's been unchallenged since 1988. And basically that the sport is suffering from bad coaching and a focus too much on technique, or too much lighter load lifting to develop technique and not focusing on what the whole idea is, which is to lift heavy stuff. Lift things that are heavier tomorrow than you did today. And again, I agree with that, what he has to say about that. So let's talk a little about coaching philosophy and then some of the other things he touched on. I do think he's on point for whatever that's worth, but I think you have to be, I hate this word because it's been abused in the last decade, but there is some nuance to what he has to say. I think we have to flesh out some details. So first of all, this idea that the sport isn't advancing because the clean and jerk hasn't been advanced since 1988, okay? And that the coaching world is screwed up because of that. Part of the issue is the drug use back in 88 was more rampant than it is now. I'm not stupid enough to think that there's no drug. Lasha's been popped, right? But the blatant use of it and the continual use of it back then was much greater than it is today. I think you see this reflected in the size of the men that lifted the weights. I think Rippetoe even talked about Tarenko's 166. I think he said he guesstimated he weighed around 315, where Lasha's weighing 375 and moving these loads. And by Lasha just snatched the house though compared to everybody else. So I think we're seeing some advancements in training in a different way. So I'll get to that in a second. But I think what's happened is back then the drug use was so high, it artificially inflated the world records like drug use does, where now the drug use is not as rampant. It's not as rampant. And so you don't see that kind of, you're seeing more of a natural incline in performance over time as compared to in the 80s when drug use was just in 70s, in 1970 when it really picked up, right, into the 80s when it was just off the wall. I mean, it was just, pre-Lyle Zato, nobody knew what it was really. Let's just do this thing. I mean, people knew it was in the sport, but right, it was more rampant. Tarenko could have been just a freak too. I mean, you have to kind of think that these guys lifting these big weights are probably freaks. So if you had somebody on drugs that was a freak, this is what you get. You have somebody like Lasha who was on drugs, hypothetically isn't anymore. And again, I don't know if he isn't. It's not for me to say. I'm not, but he's moving some big weights. He's a big dude too in order to do it. So I think the comparison of world records is unfair in that the previous world record was pushed way before its time because of the drug use. by an athlete that was highly skilled, obviously in a freak of nature, just by virtue of who he was physiologically. Now you're seeing more of a natural increase, and I use that term natural loosely, increase in loads over time. So we're getting more of a true reflection of increase. So now, 30 years later, we're finally seeing people, hit 265 and probably clearly able to hit the clean and jerk world record, like beat that previous record. He has a world record now based on the new weight classes, but with a world record, if you think about the all-time record, how's that in a competition? So I think there's some issues with that. I could be wrong. Happy to be so, but that's just my viewpoint from there, is that any drug use inflates records. That's just the reality of it. Ben Johnson beat Carl Lewis in the 1988 Olympics, and people have argued whether Carl Lewis is on drugs or not. I don't know, but Ben Johnson was clearly on drugs because he got popped, and he beat Carl Lewis by 1.5 meters, 2 meters, and he was screwing around at the end. So I always tell my students, they don't have any idea who these people are. Maybe you don't either, but look at the still shot when he crosses the fit. That's anabolic steroid use. Okay, and so those times now are being run, okay, but it took time to get there, okay, by athletes that are presumed clean or cleaner, because there's more of a threat to be popped. So just something to think about when you think about reflecting on records. His other points, though, well, let me back up just a second. So the other problem was in the United States is, why aren't we seeing records? When in the male side, I think you see the men's team struggle a little bit on an international stage, and there's some great lifters out there. Don't get me wrong, but as a whole, why don't we have super heavyweight champion? Well, it's because they're the point of starting strength is they're playing in the NFL. I tell people that ask me, right? Well, we have Olympic gold medalists, but they realize they could either be Olympic gold medalists and really get nothing out of it financially, or go make $10 million a year or $5 million a year playing NFL football. You can see this kind of talent. Years ago at Nationals, a couple years ago, there was a guy from NC State who was a lineman for them. I think he was graduated or just finished, and I've never seen him before. Showed up and won the silver medal. Just kind of, I would just say cold turkey. And I know he trained up for it. I'm just saying though, there's a lot of guys like him. There was a guy that was a fringe roster player years ago in a B flight of U.S. Nationals in 2013. And he power clean and jerked 165. It just wasn't a big deal, right? And this was a fringe roster player for the Steelers, meaning he didn't make it, but he was close, right? So the talent is there, okay? There's these big, strong, gifted individuals that are out there. But the reality is they're doing other things, especially on the men's side. The sport of softball has siphoned off a lot of female athletes as well, because that sport is a power and strength sport. I've seen a lot of strong softball players, but because the sport of softball, which I enjoy watching, has grown, it's taken a lot of female lifters away from it. So there's a lot of pulls away from sports. People talk about the Chinese lifters, and Rippetoe's point is right on. If you have 1 billion people to choose from, and there's a sports selection process in place in order to do so, and you don't have any other monetary rewarding system that's power sport based, weightlifting has become a big deal in China. And so, again, with the selection process now, and the celebrity and the fame and fortune that come with the sport that you might have in the NFL here, yes, you're going to shave off some of the talent in the United States that might be able to compete with the talent in these other countries. So when you look at the United States lifting, I think that's an issue. And, to Rippetoe's point, though, about coaching being too obsessed with technique and lower load training than heavier loads. So you watch a lot of these guys Worlds, they'll come to the training hall, hit 90, 95% of what they hit in the meet, right? Garage Strengths, Dane Miller does a good job talking about this. And what he points out, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, is this is the nuance part. I hate that word. This is the more details that are important in thinking about this. Those are world-class weightlifters. I've been around world-class athletes in the ski world, in the rowing world, that went to the Olympic Games. You're talking about the best in their sport. And the one thing that's just sticks out more than anything else, besides their mental approach, is the ability to recover. And this is what anabolic steroids does in many sports, right? It's not about getting jacked. It's about recovery. So you can take on more volume. If you can take on more volume, you get better. But if you can't recover, you can't take on more volume. So there's a gifting physiologically that goes along with being an elite athlete. So I think this idea then, what I'm getting at is Rippetoe talked about, you need to lift heavier weights. You can't just lift 70 and 80% loads, lighter weights, and just refine your technique and then expect that to show up when you lift heavy weights. And I agree with that. The problem is for non-drug athletes and non-elite athletes is how many times can you hit those heavier loads and recover? This is where a careful programming has to be done. So I think when somebody hears, well, I just should be just lifting heavy crap all the time, because progressive overload is the name of the game. Like we go on these rabbit trails all the, I've had coaches and individuals talk to me like, how do you program? This is so hard. It's like, and I've went through this myself, is don't get lost in the weeds on programming. And all these, I love technology, but we can get lost in all that stuff. At the end of the day, it's just, did you lift more today than you did yesterday? I mean, put more weight on the bar. In the sport of Olympic style weightlifting, I agree with that. The problem I see with this idea of just lift heavy all the time is, again, one, who are we talking about? Two, like I work with collegiate athletes that don't take care of themselves a lot of times. The ones I have now do a pretty good job, but I mean, in the past that, they don't take care of themselves as much nutrition, sleep-wise. They go to school, they have a lot of, they have stresses, blah, 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 that are real and perceived. And so their recovery is what I'm getting is affected. And if recovery is important to be able to take these heavy loads repeatedly, this is where the drug use is exceptional, and this is where just being gifted is exceptional. And people who don't have those giftings and don't use drugs, they're going to have a greater challenge in recovery. So hitting these higher percentages repeatedly is more difficult. It's going to take more programming. Now, the Penley method, if you've read that, I highly recommend you take that book. I take up that book. Just in general on strength training, Penley struggled with this too, and he came up with some pretty good schemes, right? Within a week's time, in order to make use of this supercompensation model, fitness fatigue model, in order to see gains in short periods of time, but not kill the individual. Understanding like the Bulgarian method, I mean, the coach of the Bulgarian method was called the butcher for a reason. People just don't survive that without drugs. You cannot do the Bulgarian method effectively without drugs. I'm confident in saying that. Okay, even some of these high performance athletes that are really good adapters and recover quickly, they would not be able to recover from that method, at least not very long, because it's an overreaching cycle for them. Even in the Bulgarian method on drugs, those athletes, there was not many of them because, again, the coach was called the butcher for a reason, right? So in theory, this idea of lifting heavy all the time is support. I agree with that. You have to, lifting 95% is different in terms of technique coordination, right? And just getting, I'm going to use the word generic, feel of the load as compared to 70%. The mental approach has to be different, okay? I think this is where auto-regulation can be helpful. Just saying, hey, what's the heaviest for today? Using variance is very important. This is that Louis method that Glenn Penley adopted and I've adopted as well, is, let's lift heavy, but let's not do the whole lift. Let's do a partial off the block. Let's do jerks off the block. Let's do power jerk. Let's PR in something. Okay. Let's PR in something. Again, the challenge for me, especially on the men's side, has been not trying to kill those athletes because they don't recover well from that type of work. They get fried. And so there has to be some careful programming involved. But I agree with Coach Rippetoe that technique is sometimes too much of the focus. I remember yelling this at an athlete at a university in Nashville. She was so focused on technique. She was just, my technique. I just told her, don't worry about the freaking technique and just go out there and lift weights, right? And there were some people around who looked at me like it was sacrilege, right? Well, I can't believe that coach just said that. He's a terrible coach. But at the end of the day, what's the sport? Weightlifting, right? So when like young lifters, training age lifters ask me time, well, I didn't do that right because did your elbows lock out at the end? Yeah, so so even when I teach athletes, I have to counsel them sometimes, the ones that are perfectionists, that I have to do the technique just right. Well, don't forget the name of the game is weightlifting. CJ Cummings this is one of the funniest and I think best examples of this. When he put up one of his junior world records in a clean and jerk, somebody commented like, oh, his technique could be so much better, blah, blah, blah. And everybody in response, or not everybody, a lot of people in response to that said, world record. That was the only thing that needed to be said. How many world records do you have? Okay. Yes, his technique could be better, but I didn't go to Olympic Games. I mean, the guy is just freaking strong and gifted and works hard. So if his technique isn't perfect, could it get a little better? Sure. His coach is a good coach. He's probably working on it, but he's still lifting. Remember, the sport is called weightlifting, not technique grading. So, when somebody, with that said, when somebody's starting out, they need technique. Absolutely. You have to learn the technique. But once they've reached the point, and everybody's a little bit different how fast they gain that technique, and this could go for anything. Once they gain that technique, then it's not about technique anymore as much as exposing the athlete to heavy loads as much as possible, because the name names get stronger, and or exposing them to volume that has enough practice with heavy loads. So that's why the 80% is a nice place to practice, because it's heavy enough to challenge the athlete, but it's not so heavy that it can still get some reps in. So again, this is where we have to be careful when we start talking about, well, let's just take these heavy reps all the time. Okay, for your average lifter, that's not going to be enough practice for them to develop technique under a moderate to heavy load or a near maximal load. Even as you get close to 90 now, it's going to trim the amount of reps that they can get in a session. And so, always going to 90 and plus % is a mistake. You have to still be able to pull back and create volume enough to practice with, to build a lot of the timing and even the strength associated power with pulling a bar. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, when it comes to the accessory work, I'm a big believer in accessory. I think it was Coach Pierce. I thought I read this somewhere. He was Kendrick Ferris' head coach at Louisiana, Shreveport. But he said, learn a technique and get stronger everywhere. There you go. That's there's a video IWF put out years ago, Lift the World. And if you watch that, I think it's the Mexican coach that's in the video. It's profiled. Like the lifter he's working with, she's like doing machine overhead press, and it's like, what the heck? Get stronger everywhere. Get stronger everywhere. Accessory work, like everybody, oohs and ahs at the Chinese weightlifters. Oh, Lou's back is so jacked. We just does, and granted, he's been like genetically like weeded out, right? I mean, he's out of a billion people, the sports school identified him as a good weightlifter, and he's been a very good weightlifter. But his back isn't anything unusual. If you do bodybuilding, if you do accessory work, like there should be, I program them for what it's worth, accessory work all the time in my programs. I want, especially the athletes I deal with, I'm not dealing with international weightlifters. I'm dealing with people that are trying to improve. And so they need a stronger back. They need bigger shoulders. More muscle mass equals more force output. Bigger legs equals more force output. Okay. There is a neurological component, and you'll see some of my videos when I talk about that. You become neurologically efficient over time. There's no doubt about it. But if you look at over time, what's going to make a big difference, it's exposure to the load and getting quote unquote used to it and gaining muscle mass. This is why, and I won't go down this rabbit hole, but like a bodybuilder is gigantic and gets bigger faster, assuming that they're clean, bigger faster than a weightlifter will. But the weightlifter's stronger, assuming their genetics equal, etc. Well, it's because of the way they train and the type of muscle adaptation that's occurring. With the weightlifter, it's going to take longer to see those gains in size, but the size gains they get are going to be cross-sectionally produce more force than the bodybuilder who just doesn't care about the force necessarily. It cares that he or she cares about the size of the muscle. And so they're going to train in such a way to build the supportive tissues, right? What we call sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, or if we go down in the more generic words, non-functional versus functional hypertrophy, okay? But there's a difference, and you can look at my videos on that if you're interested. But in the supportive lifts, so what I'm getting at is, there's some standards like with squatting that I think should be reached. Like a male lifter should squat 2 times body weight. That'd be an ultimate goal. Female lifter, at least 1.5, moving up towards 1.75 times body weight. There is a point, though, with those supportive exercises that more is not necessarily better. So squatting three times body weight isn't necessarily going to make you a better Olympic-style weightlifter. Is it going to help? Sure. But what is going to be the most beneficial for that athlete at that point? Probably lifting heavy loads in the actual lifts or variants of those lifts, snatch and clean jerk. And so, again, why Rippetoe, I agree with Rippetoe. Like, Lash is a big, strong dude. That's why he's launching weights. Don't disagree with that at all. I think we do focus on technique too much. However, I do think we have to be careful what we're defining as how we're getting strength. Like, the exercises, they're going to be a little bit different. I don't need the biggest bent over row in the world to be a better weightlifter. But I do need to be proficient in the bent row. I do need to spend time with it. I should have a well-developed back that can hold loads without any problem. And not just in competition, but be able to tolerate multiple reps at heavy loads in practice from week to week. So, I overall, for whatever this is worth, it's more like a rant. I agree with Rippetoe. There's some things I think, though, that need to be fleshed out. And to make a blanket statement that weightlifting coaches are, focusing on the wrong things and coaching sucks. And it's really just about getting these athletes big and strong. I think that's true, but you have to define big and strong where, like what, and then when do you shift your focus? Young athlete, I want to see their squat numbers come up first. Like, that's my main goal besides teaching them technique. So you kind of have these two things going on. You have technique development going on, and then you have their squat numbers coming up. They just got to get big and strong, and just gets big and strong everywhere. That's why we have weight classes. The bigger and stronger you are, the more weights you lift. But then there's reached a certain point where, okay, their strength in some of these supportive exercises, like squat, etc., have reached a point where any further benefit is not going to be that big of a deal. So I'll shift more of my training volume and recovery then to having them these athletes operate with heavier lifts in the snatch and clean and jerk itself, the variance, etc. All right. I'm sure I wandered over the place. I'm at 20 minutes. Check out the video. Don't have kids in the car, or don't listen to kids if you're, it's strength coach talk. But it's an interesting video to think about. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think a lot of what he said is true. It shouldn't, I don't disagree with a lot of it. I just think there's some details that need to be provided in order to, correctly flesh out that argument that he was making. Okay. I'll see you in the next video.